Having pastored in New Zealand for 40 years, I like to think that I'm a friend of most pastors, most ministries here in New Zealand. And I want to give a big shout out today to my good friend, Bishop Brian and Hannah Tamaki. Today, they've been married for 42 years. Now, that's a chunk of time. Bev and I have been married 50 years. And so, it's amazing how time goes by. But I want to ask you the question. I wonder how many of us, in driving around in our free society, have forgotten about Bishop Brian, who is still unjustly being confined to his home. He can't even go to the dairy. And my question is, I ask you, is he a threat to society? Of course he's not, but he's under, as it were, house arrest, confined to his home. He's now restricted in the work he can do that he's been doing for the past 40 years. And that is helping people find Christ, helping the most vulnerable, something that many other people cannot do. You may not agree with what he did, but he was standing for freedom, your freedom, against the vaccine passports. He is standing for the outdated, unjust mandates that I know will be lifted very soon. But two things, I just want to encourage you today. God down through the centuries, God's people down through the centuries have been no strangers to controversy. Most of us would have heard of Charles Finney, one of the greatest evangelists of all time. He lived in the 1800s and was a major player in the Second Great Awakening of America. Jonathan Edwards, by the way, was one of the greatest preachers of all time who was primarily responsible for the First Great Awakening. An interesting fact that Jonathan Edwards was so strong on the doctrine of God's sovereignty, while Charles Finney was strong on the doctrine of man's responsibility. Both, I believe, are biblical truths, but it does show us how, although we may not always agree with each other, God can use us all. Let me say a couple of things in relation to Charles Finney, because we have some controversial topics today, do we not? Another thing that I've been opposed to, and that is the segregation of congregation on the basis of vaccine status. In 1851, Finney became a president of a college, and he took on the appointment on two conditions. Number one, they would allow black students to enroll and attend the college. Two, they would allow female students. Now, you've got to understand that it wasn't until 1962, 63, when America started to integrate racially schools. Can you imagine the controversy in the 1800s? That was for Finney. Not only did he not segregate on the basis of race or gender, and I have to say, by the way, in spite of our modern liberal world, there are still only two genders, but Finney was a forerunner. He would have been completely misunderstood. Although people have the misconception that church is old-fashioned and out of date, the scripture says the church is called to be the head and not the tail. And if you know your history in many things, be it hospitals, medicine, science, arts, the church has always led the way. And the world normally catches up to the church. It may take them a while. The only segregation that Finney did, by the way, and maybe this is a lesson here for all our PC and woke pastors, is that in 1832, he barred slave owners and slave traders from partaking of communion. Again, like William Wilberforce, who got slavery abolished in England, this was such a divisive issue of the day, controversy, remembering that the slave owners were the wealthy, influential people of the day. But Finney stood for righteousness, even in the face of unpopularity. I wonder if that was Brian's problem. Now with COVID restrictions being lifted this week, it's interesting how the opposition are now saying what the protesters were saying just a few weeks ago. Lift the unjust mandates, the outdated, useless vaccine passports. Yes, of course, the so-called experts, the naysayers, the doom and gloom epidemiologists, those who have been wrong in all their predictions so far, they love their time in the limelight. It's like their Spartacus moment. They want to drag it out. But common sense tells us all that we must, like the rest of the world, move on.